In a cemetery in Virginia, there is a grave with an instruction attached. The instruction says the body must not be moved. The man in it has been dead since 1961. He is sealed in concrete inside a metal vault. He was not killed in a war. The job that night was routine maintenance. He never saw the thing that killed him. Nothing in that room was hot. Nothing in it made a sound. Nothing in it looked any different. That is what this video is about. 10 objects. Every one of them killed people. Not one of them looked dangerous. We are counting down from 10. The order is not how many died. The order is how close each object got to an ordinary life. Number 10 sat behind a fence in the Idaho desert. Number 1 was sold in a bottle for $1. Along the way, you will hear the same sentence again and again. Nobody could tell. A brick lands. A screwdriver slips. A control rod comes out too far. A liquid goes into the wrong shaped tank. A paintbrush touches a lip. None of those look like anything. None of them make a sound. Every one of them killed somebody. Here is the part that surprised me most. Most of these things were not weapons. A machine built to cure cancer. A watch so you could read the time in the dark. A bottle of medicine. Most of them were built to help. Number 10 is a control rod in a small army reactor. The reactor sat behind a fence in the Idaho desert. It was called SL-1. It was a test machine built to power Arctic radar stations. On the 3rd of January 1961, 3 men worked the night maintenance shift. You are picturing an explosion. There was one. But nothing nuclear detonated. What exploded was water. The reactor was shut down and the job was routine. Lift the central control rod by hand, about 4 inches. 4 inches is the width of a hand. The rod came up about 20. 16 inches was the entire difference. With the rod that far out, the chain reaction started feeding itself. The whole event took about 4/1000ths of a second. In that time, the reactor reached thousands of times its normal power. The water around the core flashed instantly to steam. The steam struck the lid like a hammer. The entire reactor vessel jumped about 9 feet into the air. Then it dropped back into place. All 3 men had already taken a fatal dose. That happened in the first instant, before anything moved. Nobody had seen it happen, so the investigators read the metal the men had been carrying. A screw from a cigarette lighter in Richard McKinley's pocket. The buckle of John Byron's brass watch strap. The gold wedding ring on Richard Legg's finger. Everyone had been altered, right through the metal. That change only happens at one intensity. A wedding ring is how they proved what the reactor had done. Rescuers reached the building within minutes. Their measuring devices went to the top of the scale and stopped telling them anything. 2 of the men were brought out that night. The 3rd could not be reached at all. It took 4 days just to plan how to recover him. On the 9th of January, 10 men went in. 2 at a time. 65 seconds each. That was the entire shift. They worked with hooks on the ends of long poles. All 3 men were buried as radioactive waste. Lead-lined caskets, sealed in concrete, inside metal vaults. Richard McKinley lies in Arlington National Cemetery. His grave carries a note. The body must not be moved. A rod came up 16 inches too far. Nothing was hot to the touch. Nothing looked any different. Number 9 is a ball of plutonium the size of a grapefruit. 2 halves, plated in nickel, in a New Mexico laboratory. The men who worked on it called it Rufus. Later, other people called it the Demon Core. The core was never going to explode like a bomb. In that shape, it was not possible. What it could do was start a reaction that feeds itself. To make that happen, you did not add anything. You only had to change the shape around it. Put the right material close enough, and the particles bounce back in. Move that material a few millimeters. In August 1945, Harry Daghlian was working alone at night. He was stacking blocks of tungsten carbide around the ball. He had stacked more than 200 kilograms of them. The counters told him the next block would tip it over, so he decided not to place it. As he pulled his hand back, the block slipped. It landed dead center. Daghlian died 25 days later. An army guard sat in the same building, not involved. He took a dose too. 9 months on, Louis Slotin demonstrated the same experiment. Slotin had co-authored the report on Daghlian's accident. He knew exactly how that story ended. His method was to lower a shell over the ball, holding a gap open. The far edge rested on the tip of a screwdriver. That blade stood between 8 men and a runaway reaction. In May 1946, it slipped. A guard named Patrick Cleary was there. He wrote it down 9 days later. He saw a blue glow and felt a wave of heat. Cleary did not know what the ball was. He ran for the hills. People call that blue flash the glow you see in a reactor pool. In air, it is not. That glow needs water or something like it. Cleary saw the air itself, briefly lit up by being torn apart. Slotin pulled it apart with his hands in half a second. That did not save him. He died 9 days later. 8 men were in that room, and each got a different dose. The numbers differ only by where they stood. By a hospital error, Slotin was put in Daglian's old room. They died in the same bed. The core was never used in a test. It was melted down that summer and went back into the stockpile. Number 8 is not an object anybody feared. It is a steel tank in a fuel plant in Japan. Its job was to hold liquid while something settled out. In September 1999, 3 men were making fuel at Tokai-mura. You may have heard that they mixed uranium in a bucket. Buckets were involved, and they broke the rules. But the buckets killed nobody. What killed people was the shape of a container. Here is the part that matters, and it is pure geometry. The approved vessels were tall and narrow. Narrow is safe. A thin column leaks too many particles out of its sides. The tank they used instead was squat and wide. A fat one holds on to what a thin one loses. Same liquid, same amount of uranium. Different shape, different outcome. So why did they use the wrong one? Because the approved columns had a drain tap near the floor. The tank had a stirrer and stood at working height. It was easier. 1 man stood on a step, pouring from a flask. A second man stood below him, holding a funnel steady. In the 7th batch, the liquid got deep enough to matter. It ran for about 20 hours. There was no alarm for this. The license for the building called such an accident not credible. So the building had no detector for it. Instruments were driven in from another site while it was still running. Teams of 3 went in one at a time, on a strict clock. They drained the water jacket because the water was part of the problem. The man on the funnel died 82 days later. The man pouring died after 210. The 3rd man sat at a desk a few meters away. He took 1/10 of the dose and lived. That is the whole difference between those 3 men, not what they touched, how far away they were standing. Every object so far had somebody near it. Number 7 had nobody near it at all. In the Ural Mountains stood a city that was not on maps. It made plutonium and a great deal of waste. The waste went into steel tanks, buried in concrete, cooled by water. In September 1957, one of those was Tank 14. Its cooling system failed. The water evaporated and kept evaporating. Now here is the chemistry in plain terms. That crust contained 2 things. One of them burns. The other one feeds burning. In liquid, they had sat there for months doing nothing. Dried out and heated, they became an explosive. The crust reached about 340 degrees. That is roughly the temperature at which it ignites. Tank 14 exploded that afternoon, not a nuclear one. Estimates of the force disagree, and I will not pretend otherwise. Russian work puts it near 25 tons of high explosive. The United Nations estimate is 3 or 4 times higher. 9/10 of it fell within a few kilometers. It came down in a stripe 300 kilometers long. The contaminated area was roughly the size of New Jersey. Inside that stripe lived 250,000 people. 10 to 12,000 of them were moved out. The last waited nearly 2 years. Nobody died of radiation sickness. That part is true and worth saying plainly. What happened instead was slow. 50 years of follow-up found a small, real excess of cancer. About 2 in every 100 cancers they're traced back to this. The Soviet Union said nothing for 31 years. A biologist named Georges Medvedev worked it out anyway in 1976. He did it by reading Soviet ecology papers. He saw what they were studying and reasoned backwards to the land. Medvedev was called a fantasist. In 1979, Oak Ridge National Laboratory read the same papers and agreed. Moscow admitted it in July 1989. You will read that American intelligence knew, and hid it to protect the nuclear industry. The one spy flight came back covered in cloud. They called that their most serious gap on the subject. They thought it was several accidents and undercounted the area 20-fold. You cannot hide a picture you never had. Number 6 is not really one object. It is a cloud of white ash falling on a wooden deck. In March 1954, the United States tested a hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll. They expected something like 1,000 Hiroshimas. What they got was 2.5 times that. The cause was one chemical assumption. The fuel contained 2 forms of lithium. The designers counted one form as fuel. They assumed the other form, most of it, would do nothing. It did not sit there. Inside the bomb, it burned too. Worse, burning it handed back the particle that keeps the reaction going. What they had written off was most of the bomb. The blast went off at the surface of a coral reef. Powdered coral went up and came down. It came down as a fine white powder. 80 miles east, a Japanese fishing boat was working. The boat was called the Lucky Dragon. 23 men were on board. They were outside the zone ships had been told to avoid. The crew saw the sky light up in the west. Minutes later, they heard it. Then the powder began falling. It fell for hours. It gathered on the deck, in their hair, in their food. The crew had no idea what it was, so some of them tasted it. They found it gritty, like sand, with no flavor. It did not melt like snow. The crew called it the death ash. They lost hair within a week. The chief radio operator, Eikichi Kuboyama, died that September. Whether radiation killed him is disputed, and the dispute is political. Japan recorded his death as a consequence of the fallout. The American position was hepatitis, caught from a transfusion. The infection came with the treatment. Without the ash, none of it happens. Number 6 fell on a boat that could sail away. Number 5 is the same ash, falling on people's houses. Rongelap is an inhabited atoll, 100 miles from Bikini. 64 people lived there in 1954. Nobody had told them a test was happening. That morning, they saw a second sunrise, in the wrong direction. Hours later, the powder arrived. It settled on the roofs. It settled in the catchments, which held the island's drinking water. It settled on the ground where children played. Survivors described children playing in it. It looked like snow, and none of them had seen snow. Nobody came for 2 days. 64 people lived in that powder for 44 hours. They were taken off 2 days later. Their doses are still called estimates because they were reconstructed later. The figure for the whole body is bad. The figure for the children's thyroid glands is far worse. Most who were small children there in 1954 later needed thyroid surgery. One, exposed as a baby, died of leukemia at 19. You may have read this was a deliberate experiment. The study was approved after they were exposed, not before. But there is a documented thing that is worse. In 1957, the United States called Rongelap clean and moved everyone back. American scientists wrote down why that was useful. Having these people live there, they wrote, would give valuable data on human beings. That sentence is in the record. Rongelap was not clean. People kept getting sick, kept saying so, and were not believed. In 1985, a Rongelap senator named Jeton Anjane gave up waiting. He asked Greenpeace for a ship. The Rainbow Warrior made 3 trips and moved everyone to another island. They took their homes apart and carried them along. Weeks later, French agents bombed that ship in Auckland. Rongelap is still mostly empty. The ash fell for 1 afternoon. People have been leaving ever since. Number 4 begins with a building nobody was watching. A private cancer clinic in Goiânia, Brazil, moved premises. It left something behind in the old building. Inside, a heavy metal housing sat a core of cesium. The clinic never told the regulator it was there. The building was partly demolished around it. For 2 years it sat in the ruins. In September 1987, 2 men scavenging for scrap found it. They took it apart and wheeled the inner part home. 3 days later, one of them punctured the capsule. Inside was a powder. In the dark, it glowed a deep blue. Here is the part almost nobody knows about cesium. The form in that capsule was a salt. Salt dissolves. Salt sticks to skin, cloth, banknotes, bus seats. The scrapyard owner bought the pieces. He thought the glow beautiful, possibly valuable, possibly holy. Grains went to friends and family as gifts. His brother took some home and spread it on the floor. His 6-year-old niece was eating a sandwich. She had the powder on her hands. She died 5 weeks later. More than 100,000 people had to be checked. 249 were contaminated. 4 people died. It was stopped by one woman. Maria Gabriela Ferreira worked out that everyone near the dust was sick. She put what was left in a plastic bag. She carried it across the city on a bus to the health department. Maria Gabriela Ferreira died with the others. The little girl was buried in a coffin lined with lead. More than 2,000 people came to stop the burial. They threw stones and blocked the roads. They were not cruel. The crowd was terrified, and nobody had ever explained any of it. Number 3 is the only one on this list aimed at people on purpose. It is a machine for treating cancer, the Thorac-25. Its job was to fire a measured beam into a tumor. Between 1985 and 1987, 6 patients got doses nobody measured. At least 3 died of it. The prescribed dose was a couple of 100 units. Some received 100 times that. One took the whole of it in under a second, all of it into a patch of skin the size of a fingernail. The cause was 2 separate software faults. The first is about typing speed. The machine had 2 modes. One fired a weak beam directly. The other fired a beam 100 times stronger into a metal target that soaked it up. An operator could type the mode, cursor up, change it, go back down. Do that inside 8 seconds and the machine set the strong beam, but left the target out of position. A counter ticked up by 1 at every setup. It could only hold up to 255. On every 256th setup, it rolled to 0. So the fault showed up once in every 256 goes. Here is why every software engineer is taught this case. Both faults existed in the previous model. That machine had physical switches wired in to stop the beam. The same bugs fired there and blew a fuse. The new model dropped the switches and kept the software. In June 1985, a woman in Georgia felt a red-hot sensation. She told the technician he had burned her. He told her that was not possible. The machine had reported nothing. Nancy Leveson and Clark Turner published the definitive study in 1993. The lesson is not that there was a bug. The lesson is that the maker kept fixing bugs and never fixed what produced them. Blaming the operator is the other wrong answer. The interface rewarded speed. The fastest way to work was the way that killed people. Number 2 is a wristwatch. Specifically, it is the glowing paint on the numbers. Around the First World War, watch dials were hand-painted in factories. The paint held radium, and radium made it glow. That is not quite right, and the correction matters. The paint held a second powder that glows when something hits it. The radium was the thing hitting it. The women were hired for a fine, steady hand. To paint them, the brush must come to a point. There are several ways to point a brush. Both waste paint and radium was expensive, so they were taught to point the brush with their lips. Dip, point, paint. Dip, point, paint. They asked whether it was safe. They were told that it was. Instructors sometimes swallowed the paint to prove it. The paint dust got everywhere. It was in their hair, on their clothes, on their skin. Women walked home glowing faintly in the dark. Some painted their nails with it and their teeth for fun. Radium behaves in the body like calcium. The body cannot tell them apart, so it filed the radium where it files calcium, which is bone. The jaw went first. A young woman named Amelia Maggia had her lower jaw removed in pieces. She was alive throughout. She died in 1922, aged 24. Her death certificate said syphilis, which was untrue, and her family had to fight it. 5 years on, her body was exhumed and examined. Every piece of tissue and bone still registered. Their bones did not glow, whatever you have read. They did something stranger. Laid on a covered plate in a dark room, a bone took its own picture. Grace Fryer and 4 others sued, and settled in 1928. At the hearing, not one of the 5 could raise an arm to take the oath. In Illinois, Catherine Donohue testified in 1937 under 70 pounds. She won in 1938. She died the day after the company filed its next appeal. Everything so far happened to somebody. Number 1 is different. Number 1 is a thing people bought on purpose because they wanted it. It was called radiether. It was water in a small bottle with radium dissolved in it. The label promised it would cure fatigue and restore vigor. That was the entire selling point. A bottle cost $1. The man behind it was William Bailey. Bailey was not a doctor. He claimed a Harvard degree he did not have. He claimed a Vienna doctorate that did not exist. Bailey had already pleaded guilty to practicing medicine illegally. He sold the water anyway, at 4 times what it cost to make. In 1927, a wealthy American named Eben Byers hurt his arm. Byers liked it and said so loudly. He drank it daily for nearly 3 years. That is roughly 1,400 bottles. Cases went to his friends. He gave it to his racehorses. Byers stopped in October 1930 when his teeth began falling out. The radium had gone where radium goes, into bone. An investigator sent to see him in 1931 wrote down what he found. He wrote that the whole upper jaw was gone, bar 2 front teeth. Holes, he wrote, were forming in the man's skull. He testified against Bailey while this was happening. He died in March 1932. Byers was buried in a coffin lined with lead. In 1965, his body was exhumed so his bones could be measured. 33 years dead, the radium was still there, still counting. What was left of him held about 60 times the limit a person may now carry. Bailey outlived him by 17 years. He died of bladder cancer in 1949. He liked to say he had drunk more radiether than anybody alive. Go back and look at what these 10 things were. A machine built to cure cancer. A watch so a soldier could read the time in a trench. A bottle of medicine. A plant making fuel for electricity. Most of these were not built to hurt anybody. Several were built specifically to help. And every single time, the same thing was true. Nobody could tell. There was no smell. There was no heat a hand could feel. Nothing looked any different. A man stacking blocks felt nothing until the counters told him. A crew tasted the ash because tasting it was the only way to find out. A scrapyard owner thought a blue glow was a gift. A woman on a treatment table said she had been burned. She was told that was not possible. That is the thread. None of these people was careless in a way you or I would not have been. They were working with something that gives no warning. And using senses that evolved to find heat and edges and rot. We have no sense for this. We had to build one. That is the real ending of every one of these stories. Somebody eventually measured it. A counter was brought into the room. A file was opened. A study was published. A woman put a bag on a bus and carried it across a city. She had worked it out before anyone else. Every rule around these objects now is written from one of these cases. That is a grim way to write a rulebook. It is also why you have never had to think about any of this. In a cemetery in Virginia, there is a grave that must not be opened. Now you know why.